In the 19th century came men who went out into the landscape and shaped it to their own design, with iron, steam, and fire. These are the men who made the modern world. On December the 5th, 1831, the 10 o'clock Manchester to Liverpool intercity service was on time as usual. It had been running for over a year. Yet for many passengers, this was their first experience of travelling faster than a galloping horse. Among them was a man conducting a spot of industrial espionage. 25-year-old Isambard Kingdom Brunel wanted to build his own railway, so he was checking out the competition. He saw plenty of room for improvement, as his diary testifies.
I record this specimen of the shaking on Manchester Railway. The time is not far off when we shall be able to take our coffee and write while going noiselessly and smoothly at 45 miles per hour. Let me try.
These were brave words from someone whose engineering ventures had all been heroic failures. His great tunnel under the Thames had been abandoned, and his suspension bridge at Clifton had run out of finance. Brunel wanted to build a railway that would be smoother, faster, and better than any other. He had a big advantage over his competitors. He knew how to win friends and influence people. It was a lesson George Stephenson, the man behind the Manchester-Liverpool Railway, never learned. This self-taught engineer from the coal mines of Northumberland had always been a practical man with little appetite for politics. Even before a single rail was laid, George ran into trouble with powerful landowners.
The ground was blockaded on every side to prevent us getting on with the survey. We had a great deal of the survey to take by stealth at the time when the persons were at dinner.
To complete his survey, George had to snatch any opportunity at dawn or dusk, whenever the guards were away.
It was never easy surveying, partly because you'd got landowners, big important people with political influence, who didn't want nasty, smelly things on their land, thank you very much, and set about stopping the surveyors coming onto their land. In some of the worst cases, even set man-traps, would you believe, to catch the surveyors.
Under the circumstances, it's perhaps not surprising that Stevenson's survey was riddled with errors. When he went before Parliament to seek approval for his plans, the objectors' lawyers had more than enough ammunition to launch a merciless attack.
I was not long in the witness box before I began to wish for a hole to creep out at.
George's dubious measurements and bluff Geordie manner did little to win over the parliamentary committee.
When he first started to go to London, apparently it really was true that people thought that his broad Northumbrian accent was a foreign accent. They thought he was German or something. They didn't know their own country in Westminster. They didn't know that people in the North East actually spoke like that. That must be incredibly belittling. You know, you're not there to excuse your accent, you're trying to explain a technology. And there's some southerner sat there saying, who is this guy? Is he from Germany? Is he a foreigner? What a joke. That's dreadful. George, he needed someone who could spell a bit better, who could write a bit better, who could do the sums to prove to parliamentary hearings, not just stand there and say, oh, I know it'll work, which is kind of his approach.
Luckily for George, he had a business partner who was everything that he wasn't. It was his son, Robert, who was well educated and had even managed to lose his Northumberland accent.
Robert was a different person from his father. Because he had the education, he was at home with the experts in a way that George never was. George was very much aware that he was a humble, uneducated man who'd pulled himself up into a position of power. But what he couldn't do was speak on equal terms with the experts. They didn't actually talk the same language.
Robert was equally at ease with the London elite as with the Geordie boilermakers, a perfect combination for the man destined to become the king of railways. Brunel was a novice by comparison, but he had started to cultivate influential contacts in Bristol. When he heard about plans for a railway from Bristol to London, he persuaded the backers that he was the man for the job. First, he would have to survey the route.
The remarkable thing about this railway survey that Brunel has to carry out, all on horseback. Everything has got to be done on horseback. There isn't any other way. And as he doesn't know exactly the route that he's going to take, he's got to quarter the countryside.
When Brunel sets out to do this railway, he had already told the directors, or the committee as it then was, at Bristol, the railway I shall build you will not be the cheapest, but it will be the best. And this was always his outlook. It's got to be the best. There's no point in doing it if it isn't the best. Brunel was trying to get the fastest possible railway he could build between Bristol and London. As straight as possible, as fast as possible, the gradients as even as possible. And he searched through the lanes high and low, looking for his way through.
Unlike George Stephenson, Brunel carried out a full and meticulous survey, and he developed his own way of dealing with awkward landowners.
He used to come along trackways like this and pass through villages, quietly looking out the land, and he didn't tell anybody what he was doing. And there is a letter he wrote where he castigates one of his assistants for telling people why they are in the village. And he says, if you go around telling everybody what we're doing here, the price of land is going to rocket. And we really do have to keep quiet about this. So please, a little secrecy if you don't mind. I've often wondered whether Brunel got off the horse at the end of one of these long, long days, 12 hours in the saddle, and didn't walk into the hotel bandy-legged. I mean, okay, he was quite young, so he was probably fairly supple, a lot more supple than I am now. But, you know, if he's been in the saddle since 6 o'clock that morning, and he's ridden across the country, and by the way, riding at the gallop, and this chap really is pushing it, isn't he?
One morning, Brunel was found asleep with the ash of a complete cigar lying on his chest. Yet his punishing regime of 20-hour days, divided into half-hour slots, paid off. He managed to survey the entire 118-mile length of the Great Western Railway in little more than a month. The line he chose did not follow the direct route of the existing turnpike road. His meandering GWR was ridiculed by detractors as the Great Way Round.
The Great Western Railway's route is, as it were, an invisible masterpiece because it's so big, people don't notice it. But the way that he designed the route is definitely his first great stroke of genius.
Before Brunel could build his railway, he had to get his plans sanctioned by Parliament. But unlike George Stephenson before him, he was more than a match for the lawyers.
There is a considerable embankment there.
No, not considerable.
By considerable, I mean 1.5 miles.
Yes, but it is not a heavy embankment.
What height?
It varies from 12 to 25 feet.
Brunel was 11 days being interrogated before a select committee with these barristers going for him, and Brunel is loving this. He is absolutely loving it. He's the centre of attention. He is handling it superbly well. He fields all their questions, and he's so good in his answers that word gets round and people are coming to the committee room just to listen to the fencing match.
It's obvious that he was a pretty impressive and compelling speaker. I think there's a sign of a very seductive accent. He's, as it were, in some ways, the Maurice Chevalier of British engineering. But on the other hand, he's capable of understanding the interests of different sections of the audience. I mean, this is a man who, if he hadn't been an engineer, would have been an extremely effective politician. And Brunel was obviously close up an extremely impressive figure, who dresses very self-consciously, who takes great care with his public image.
By the end of 1835, Brunel was given the go-ahead to build the Great Western Railway. He had finally arrived.
The railway now is in progress. I am the engineer to the finest work in England. A handsome salary, £2,000 a year. I have taken a fine house. I have a cab and horse. I have a secretary. In fact, I am now a somebody.
All that was missing from this wonderful life was a wife. In 1836, Brunel married Mary Horsley and gained a passport into London society.
It's common for men of Brunel's class in the middle of the 19th century to use marriage as another tool for social advancement. Marrying for money, marrying for inheritance, marrying for status. Brunel wanted engineers to be recognized as gentlemen, and that was financially crucial. One of the most important places that a man like Brunel could recruit the cash he needed for his projects was over the dining table or in the salon or at a party. And that meant having the wealth, the status, the social manners to run affairs like that. And for him, everything was going to be sacrificed to this kind of social and technical ambition.
She was said to be a great beauty. Maybe she was a jolly good clothes horse. And Brunel married her, dressed her up in a lot of very fine clothes, lots of jewellery, and she was well known for her promenades in St James's Park every morning, followed by 2 footmen. Promenade through the park, showing off the wealth of the Brunels, and then about turn and back indoors. That was it for the day.
Brunel was reaping the dividends of a booming railway business. As he started work on the Great Western, his rival in the north, Robert Stephenson, was employing thousands of navvies to build his railway to Birmingham.
Everybody wanted to buy shares in railways. Every railway share was going to make you a fortune. And a new generation of engineers were on hand, many of whom had learnt their trade in the canal. They took the civil engineering aspects of the canal age and applied them to the new railway age. It was still men with shovels, still barrows, pickaxes, and deep cuttings going through hills. The technology was invented in the late 18th and early 19th century to make straighter canals was simply taken over by the railways.
On the Great Western Railway, one of the biggest obstacles facing Brunel was a hill near the village of Box in Wiltshire. He had decided it was too far to go round, so he would have to go straight through. It would be the longest railway tunnel ever attempted, almost 2 miles. In 1840, Brunel moved an army of 4,000 navvies to the village. The rural community at Box was turned into a centre of industry. Every week, the workforce would need a ton of gunpowder and a ton of candles. Living conditions were horrendous. Many men slept in the open. Those lucky enough to find lodgings slept in shifts. The beds never grew cold. Adrian Vaughan follows in the footsteps of the navvy's journey to work. To reach the tunnel face, they were lowered in iron cages down one of these deep shafts.
It just disappears into darkness, and it really does look like the mouth of hell. This must be a 290-foot deep shaft, one of the 2 deepest shafts on the whole tunnel. God, what a terrifying sight that is. They had to dig these shafts to open up the working faces for the tunnel. They came along here, an army of men with their pickaxes, and they started on the bare green field, and they went down precisely on the centre line of the tunnel to the level that the rails were going to be.
It might seem odd to start digging a tunnel from the top of a hill, but to Brunel it made perfect sense. By sinking vertical shafts into the hill, he would maximize the area of rock face available for digging. From the bottom of each shaft, the navvies would dig outwards in 2 directions and eventually link up to form one tunnel. From the outset, the Box Tunnel had been one of the most difficult parts of Brunel's plan to sell to Parliament. One of his fiercest critics, Dr. Dionysius Lardner, seized upon public anxieties about the safety of the new railways.
Dionysius Lardner is one of the chief railway journalists of the period, and like a lot of pundits, he had an exaggerated sense of his own expertise. So, for example, he was deeply concerned, or at least he pretended to be deeply concerned, about the slope of the rail through the long box tunnel near Bath on the Great Western Railway, and claimed that if the brakes on the train gave way when it was going through the tunnel, it would emerge at the other end doing more than 120 miles an hour.
This was one of the few stretches of the railway where there was a gradient. Lardner claimed that the massive acceleration on the slope would suffocate passengers. But he had wildly overestimated the speed a runaway train might reach.
Brunel and his allies simply had to point out to Lardner that he'd forgotten about air resistance and friction completely. He'd committed a mistake that a schoolboy would have been ashamed of making.
While Parliament debated the dangers that passengers might encounter, little thought was given to the horrors the workmen would face when digging the tunnel. Today, under Box Hill, next to Brunel's tunnel, is a labyrinth of stone quarries. This gives us some idea of the working conditions in the 1840s.
Well, actually, it takes your breath away, really, doesn't it? The sheer difficulty that those men had. And, by the way, we've got electric light. You imagine 1 or 2 candles flickering about in this chasm. They're working in almost total darkness. Would they have hit each other with their picks? Would they have got in each other's way, hundreds of blokes all digging here? Oh, it was a nightmare, man. This was a complete nightmare working in here. You're in a cavern. The only ventilation is up that one shaft. There's just the one shaft. You have got a rock face ahead of you. You have been hammering holes into that rock face with a big iron crowbar. You've got to pack those holes with gunpowder. Not clean, efficient TNT, gunpowder. You then retreat as far as the cavern will allow you, and you hope that that's a fair way off, and then you fire this thing, and you'll be able to see, in the darkness, you could see the fuses burning.
The noxious gases and dust unleashed by gunpowder explosions made conditions underground deadly.
It must have been like Dante's Inferno down here. You've got chunks of stone flying around like shrapnel. You've got clouds of billowing sulphurous white smoke. And you've got the concussion of the air wave coming back and punching you in the lungs. And as they would be blasting fairly regularly, there would never be a chance for the fumes to disperse.
No one knows for sure how many people died digging Box Tunnel. The deaths of these itinerant workers were not properly recorded.
All we know is half of one sentence. Upwards of 100 men were killed building the box tunnel. It was a throwaway comment during evidence being given to the 1846 Select Committee on Railway Navvies. And somebody just said, and upwards of 100, like that. And they didn't even ask about it. And that's all we know.
What was recorded was the cost of the railway in pounds, shillings and pence. By the time it was completed in June 1841, Brunel had spent £6.5 million of his shareholders' money, more than double his original estimate. Brunel was determined that his Great Western Railway service would be faster and more comfortable than anything else around. He started by questioning the width of the track. Everyone was following the Stevensons, who were running their trains on a 4-foot 8.5-inch gauge. Brunel believed it was the narrow track that made the bumpy ride.
Brunel, who never takes anything on trust, comes along and says, why are we doing it like this? The George Stephenson answer is, because we always did it like that and it's fine, what's your problem? The Brunel question is, what's the sense in that? Why such a funny size? And he was right, it is a funny size.
As with everything he built, George Stephenson had done no calculations. He simply used what was to hand. He'd taken the gauge of the track from one of his pit railways in the northeast. If it could carry coal, it could carry people too.
He simply came to an existing railway at a colliery and built a locomotive to stick on top of it. And it happened to be 4 foot 8.5 inches. I mean, he was going to choose 4 foot 8.5 inches, saying that's the ideal. And he simply went on from there, building what he started with. Brunel, on the other hand, said, what would be the best gauge for a railway? If we start with a clean field, what's going to be the most efficient way of achieving fast, smooth running? And he said, rails farther apart will give greater comfort and smoother running. So he settled for 7 foot.
Brunel argued that a broader wheelbase could carry a bigger engine, which could reach higher speeds. Robert Stevenson thought his narrower gauge was perfectly adequate. Despite their professional differences, the two engineers struck up a lifelong friendship.
Robert Stevenson and I.K. Brunel were very close personal friends, and that is a very remarkable thing, because professionally they were often at loggerheads. They seem to have had no problem in personal relations putting any professional differences behind them, and they used to love going off together to act as adjudicators on other issues. There's some delightful stories about them travelling off to visit the Glasgow Waterworks, Manchester Waterworks, various other enterprises. This is the common practice. If you had a problem with a major enterprise, you call in an outside engineer just to make sure that your consultant, your resident engineer, was on the right lines.
One group of investors from Liverpool ridiculed Brunel's broad gauge experiment as a waste of money. In an attempt to get Brunel sacked, they asked his arch critic, Dr. Dionysius Lardner, to take Brunel's best locomotive for a test drive. Lardner was a staunch supporter of the Stevenson gauge and relished the chance to go over Brunel's engine with a fine tooth comb. Lardner's report was crushing. Not only was the locomotive too slow, it burned far too much fuel. According to Lardner, the train was so wide it meant increased wind resistance. Clearly, the broad gauge did not deliver what Brunel had promised: speed and efficiency. Faced with this damning evidence, the board of the GWR threatened to remove Brunel unless he agreed to consult another railway engineer.
The board of directors suggested to Brunel, I'd like to know who the brave man was who gave the message, that Robert Stevenson be brought in as a consulting engineer. Brunel wrote one of his famous letters saying, "What is a consulting engineer? Who's he going to consult with? He's not going to consult with me, thank you very much."
At the Stevenson's Newcastle Engine Works, Robert had earned his reputation as the best locomotive maker in the land, while his father George continued to play the uncouth blacksmith. There was no doubt which Stevenson was more suitable to act as consultant.
He's arm wrestling the customers. I mean, that's an embarrassing dad. He would say, while they're waiting to see Robert, he'd say, "Come on, fight you." For fuck's sake. I mean, that's as embarrassing as you get, isn't it?
The Great Western was not the only railway company petitioning for Robert's services as a consultant. Frantic investors even besieged his house. But when Robert was approached by Brunel's directors, he was particularly embarrassed.
Robert comes across as a kindly, courteous, thinking person who wonders about his own effect on the world and the people around him in an almost very modern, self-doubting sense, despite the fact that he was this incredible achiever.
Robert had always made it plain that he would not betray his friend.
Dear Brunel, I find it quite out of my power to pass a report on your permanent road. I have written declining to do so. And to do otherwise would be making myself ridiculous, since my opinions are pretty generally known. Yours very truly, Robert Stevenson.
Faced with the worst crisis in his career, Brunel decided to call the railway board's bluff. He threatened to resign.
As far as Brunel was concerned, if you wanted a railway built, you gave the job to an engineer and let him build it, and to hell with everybody else. That was his idea of perfection in life. Brunel running everything and everybody else doing exactly what Brunel told them to do.
His threat to resign took the directors by surprise. While they were deliberating, Brunel took the chance to work out what was wrong with his locomotive. He soon found the cause of his problems. The engine was underperforming at high speed because the exhaust gases were not able to flow through the funnel quickly enough. Brunel simply increased the diameter of a single tube and unleashed the full power of the engine.
Brunel, when attacked, always responds by mobilizing numbers. So he's always prepared to produce exhaustive data analysis.
He called on his friend, the mathematician and computer pioneer Charles Babbage, to carry out scientific tests to prove broad gauge was best.
Engineers like Babbage and others are recruited by Brunel to validate the whole design of the railway. Challenged to show that broad gauge was safe and okay and stable, what Babbage did was simply to travel on almost every English railway. And he would travel with a stopwatch and count every time there was an unsatisfactory bump and his cup of tea was spilt, and he would make a note in his notebook. Realizing that this was a slightly painful way of working out whether railways were safe and stable, Babbage then designed an engine, an incredibly complicated machine, which would do that task automatically. And it involved fitting up an entire railway carriage on the GWR with a long table inside the carriage and a series of rollers at either end of the table with 8 different moving pens to make marks on the paper as it moved through. And these marks would graphically record any oscillations of the railway carriage, unevenness on the track. And this automatic registering machine is really the first automatically registered black box safety system in the history of engineering.
Brunel waited until the next meeting of the Great Western Railway Board to present his results.
They were met with graphs and numbers, and they were blown away. Babbage had about 6 or 7 miles of rolls of wallpaper, which his men pinned to the wall of the meeting room, and the stockholders who'd come down from the north of England and Scotland to vote against Brunel at the meeting in the London Tavern were overwhelmed by this kind of evidence, and they decided to vote for Brunel instead.
On the 30th of June 1841, the first Great Western train made the run between Bristol Temple Meads and London Paddington.
Brunel constructed this remarkably level railway, so much so that it earned for itself the nickname of Brunel's billiard table. And to this day, they're running trains at 125 miles an hour over it, without having to alter it in any way.
I was looking up a timetable from about over 100 years ago on the Great Western Railway. I just happened to look at the time from London to Didcot. It was 5 minutes slower than the 125 I take today.
When Brunel and Stevenson pushed their two railway networks out to the far corners of the country, the engineering challenges grew. It wasn't just hills and rivers they had to contend with, but the elemental forces of fast-flowing tidal estuaries. As Brunel's line snaked westwards, it came to the mouth of the mighty Tamar that divides Devon and Cornwall. To build this bridge, he had to lay foundations for the central pier in rushing water 20 meters deep. Somehow, he had to find a way for his men to build up the pier from the riverbed without drowning. His plan was to float a huge wrought iron cylinder out into the center of the river, upend it, and sink it into the riverbed. Once it had formed a seal in the mud, he would pump out the water, leaving a dry chamber for his men to work in. At least, that was the theory.
Unfortunately for Brunel, he had a problem because the cylinder floated out, all absolutely fine, turned it round, sunk down onto the mud exactly as planned. But as it went down through the mud, it hit an obstruction of some kind and kicked over. And this kicking over disturbed the seal around the edge. And as they wiggled this thing down to the bottom, effectively they destroyed any chance they had of forming a good seal around it. And so what he found was when he came to clear the thing out, instead of being able to take the water out all the way down to the bottom, he got to some level and the water started coming in at him. And you can see there that the water is rushing in, and so they pumped away and they pumped away, and unfortunately the water just kept coming back in. So he could never get down to the bottom and he could never get his men in to dig the hole. And so what he does is he puts a lid on top of his cylinder. He is going to pump air into this now sealed cylinder, and pumping the air in there and putting pressure in it, it pushes the water back into the Tamar. And you should be able to see there that the water is getting pushed back. The air in there is now at higher pressure than it is outside. And so the guys can now go down inside there and work in the bottom nice and dry. When they got down to the bottom of this thing and they got into this, I think it's called a green sand dike, which is a volcanic rock, extraordinarily hard. I mean, you know, if you've ever banged a hole in your wall at home, this is, 100 times harder to hit than that. And these guys were there with rudimentary hand tools, digging 6 foot and 7 foot down into this stuff. It would have been astonishingly difficult work.
Back then, very little was known about the damaging effects of returning quickly to the surface after a long shift breathing compressed air. The men suffered terrible headaches and muscle pains when bubbles of gas blocked their blood circulation. They called it caisson sickness. Today, we call it the bends. In spite of the appalling conditions, there was no shortage of volunteers.
They were probably from the Cornish tin mines, and this was, they would have considered this the local gravy train, and they'll have come in here and got paid probably a lot more than they were earning down the pits. But nonetheless, I mean, this would have been hard work.
Once the central pier was in place, the next problem was how to carry several hundred tons of moving train across the bridge. Brunel's solution was so elaborate that it almost defeats the eye. At the heart of the structure is a suspension bridge. To stop the weight of the train pulling the supporting piers in on themselves, Brunel introduced an arch to hold the towers apart. Finally, the whole thing was cross-braced to give it extra strength. 180 miles north, Robert Stevenson had tackled a similar problem, but his approach had been different. He had to bridge the Menai Straits that separate the Welsh mainland from Anglesey.
What Stevenson was faced with was he had to get across this stretch of water here, which is around 600-700 feet at this position. And it was a daunting challenge. I mean, he knew that he had to keep 100 feet clear of the water to stop the tall ships from banging into the underneath of his bridge. He had to carry these very heavy railway locomotives across.
The obvious solution was to build some kind of suspension bridge. Just up the channel, Thomas Telford had shown how to do it 20 years before.
Stevenson obviously knew about Telford's bridge. I mean, he could see it. It's a mile away from his own site. But it was to carry a much lighter load. Horses, the mail coaches and things like that, it probably, weigh half a ton or a ton. What Stevenson had to do was carry trains that weighed 100 tons, or maybe 200 tons, or in fact the design load for the bridge was 500 tons. So he was talking about an order of magnitude. And there's a feature of suspension bridges that although the cables are very, very strong and they're able to carry very big loads, if you put 100 tons or 500 tons underneath them, they move around an awful lot and the bridge starts to sag directly where the load is. And as you can imagine, as the train moves along, the sagging point moves. And so a suspension bridge with a heavy train on it it will ripple.
Stevenson adopted a very different approach to Brunel. His railway would be carried over the water by an enormous wrought iron tube. In a series of experiments, he discovered that a simple rectangular tube, reinforced with a honeycomb of boxes, was immensely strong. He'd invented something that has been used by bridge builders ever since, the box girder. A section of Stephenson's box girder still remains at the site of his bridge.
What I really like about Stephenson is they didn't just invent the world's first box girder bridge with that fantastic series of experiments. They actually made the thing so huge that you could actually drive a train right through the middle of it. Absolutely incredible.
Each iron tube was 140 meters long and weighed 1,500 tons. The plan was to assemble them at the water's edge and float them out to the supporting columns. Such an operation had never been attempted on so huge a scale. Whereas Brunel relished the shock of the new, Stephenson hated it.
I think one contrast between Robert Stephenson and his embarking Brunel is that Robert Stephenson is a distinctly more conservative engineer. So even his great achievements like the Menai Bridge, which uses tubular steel, is an incremental development based on a whole series of models and careful designs.
Before the sections were moved from the shore, Stephenson staged a series of dress rehearsals with a scale model. The plan was to slide pontoons under each iron tube and let the rising tide lift it off its construction platform. Once afloat, the current would carry the tube towards the piers. Teams of men on each shore would guide the tubes to their final destination using cables and winches.
He was already a slightly nervous individual. He hadn't got the absolute self-certainty of his father. Now he's really worried. Now he's having sleepless nights. Can he actually produce a safe bridge? Is the whole thing going to fall to pieces? Is his whole career going to end there? Which was a real problem. And we know that this caused him an enormous amount of anxiety. He really worried about it, but he came through. In spite of all this nervousness, at the core was a strong man.
It was a most anxious and harassing time with me. Often at night, I would lie tossing about, seeking sleep in vain. The tubes filled my head. I went to bed with them and got up with them.
So what does he do? He writes to his mate. He writes to Brunel, and Brunel comes over. And there's this lovely image which is described as the great giant tubes floated out into the middle of the tideway. Standing on top of it, nonchalantly smoking one of his big long cigars, is his embarked Kingdom Brunel.
At high tide on the 20th of June 1849, the first tube was floated out. They had only a couple of hours to dock the tube at the piers before the tide started to fall.
Brunel made a point of turning out to be there when the first tube was put into position, which was a wonderfully ticklish engineering operation. You know, any engineer looked for what help he could on those occasions, and Stephenson was deeply grateful to Brunel for turning out.
Over the next 6 months, all of the tubes were moved into position. They were slotted into channels in the masonry piers and raised by giant hydraulic jacks. The Britannia Bridge bears all the hallmarks of Stephenson's character: honest, unpretentious, and functional. Nevertheless, this simple design became a standard for railway bridges around the world. In contrast, Brunel's bridge was a masterpiece of complexity. No one ever attempted to copy it. This was not the first engineering cul-de-sac Brunel had been down. By 1846, his broad-gauge railway covered 274 miles of the national network, but it was dwarfed by Stephenson's narrow gauge, which had 7 times more track. The government decided that railways had to be standardized. There was only room for 1 gauge.
The early years, it looked as if Brunel was right, but the thing that was so wrong about the system was that it was different. And the system, when it was important, everybody should be the same. And Brunel badly underestimated the importance of the uniformity of the system. There's no doubt about that. He made a very serious misjudgment on that.
Although Brunel won on quality, he lost on quantity. It was cheaper to convert broad gauge into narrow gauge, so Stephenson's gauge became the national standard, and Brunel's technically superior railway was history.
He could have been right. He would have been right. Today, we wouldn't have to get squashed as the trolley comes down the aisle. It would go faster and safer. But there were already many miles of something near standard gauge. It spread and grew and joined up. Ultimately, standard gauge won on mileage, not on science.
Brunel's broad gauge railway may have reached the end of the line, but his answer, as always, was to look for a new challenge. In the next chapter of Brunel's Adventures, he steps off the platform and onto a gangplank, vowing to conquer the Atlantic.